can I go home now?
Thank you so much, Ron. Thank you, Jean Floten, for having me here. All the wonderful colleagues on the faculty, the staff, the students that I've met today, and the ones I just met earlier this evening. If my life has any meaning, it's because I reflect the last 30 years of American history. My family came to this country as immigrants, like I think many of you here tonight and throughout this college. And a particular kind of immigrant, my parents were refugees. That means we came with nothing, literally, but the clothes on our back. We came on an old-fashioned jet before the jet age. And my parents, after some research, decided that we should settle in a town in California called Palo Alto. Palo Alto, California, pre-Silicon Valley, I should say. And the reason is they heard of this university called Stanford. And they told my older brother, my younger sister, and me, we were to study hard and go to Stanford on a scholarship. They didn't even say, if we don't make it, we can go to Berkeley, you know. Well, I'm just thankful that I got admitted to Stanford because I shudder to think what would have happened if we didn't make it. But the point is that, on the one hand, I sometimes kid and say we were the original model minority. You know, the model minority construction of Asian Americans being extremely committed to higher education. That's a simplified version of it. But the story I really want to tell you to start off this evening, something I share with those of you with whom I had lunch today, is that my parents' timing in coming to America was very good, because we came in the 60s, and we came just at a time when the civil rights movement was unfolding in this country. And out of the civil rights movement came all kinds of public policy aimed at redressing the inequities of the past. And perhaps of all of these, certainly among the most significant was something called affirmative action. I mention that because today we are still fighting for affirmative action. And here I am in the state of Washington, like the state of California, my home state. It looks like we might be losing the fight. Unfortunately, Washington, in this instance, likes to follow the bad leadership of California to get rid of affirmative action. I want to then give testimony to affirmative action and how it affected me, because I would not be standing here probably were it not for affirmative action, which came out of the struggle of Americans of African descent to undo years, centuries of American apartheid. Yes, we did have apartheid in this country, racial segregation, legally sanctioned. We don't like to think that this country practices apartheid, just like we don't like to use the word genocide. And I will talk about that a little bit, but I use the word apartheid. And the civil rights movement was aimed at undoing apartheid, but at the same time, the country also changed its immigration laws to end decades of exclusion of immigrants from Asia, and once again allowed immigrants of Asia to come. And so our timing was good, because when we arrived, the civil rights movement opened the doors to higher education and other American institutions to those of us who also came to America. The affirmative action policy was enacted really originally for Americans of African descent, but it was quickly expanded to cover all women and all other, quote, minority groups. And that's how I got into Stanford, because I was told by the admissions officer at Stanford that my verbal score was really too low for Stanford. But that they took, and this is how affirmative action is practiced when it's practiced properly, they took into consideration the fact that English was not my native language, that I had only been in this country 3 years, that we came under very adverse circumstances, and that my counselors wrote me wonderful letters that talked about my motivation and my commitment, and etc. So Stanford admitted me despite my low verbal score, which was 611. My father kept these scores for me as a reminder. And it motivated me so that I graduated from Stanford with the award of the top student of my class. Now, this is very immodest for someone of my cultural background to brag about my achievement, and that's really not what I'm doing, because the rest of the story I'm going to tell you is the real story, the story of affirmative action. That same year, a young man called George W. Bush went to Yale University. He was then not a Texan, but a Yankee from Connecticut. And he went to a prep school called Phillips Andover. Have you heard of Phillips Andover? It's one of the elite prep schools. He went to Yale. We're exactly the same age. When this young man ran for president 30 some odd years later, this is about 2 years ago, somebody leaked his admissions record from Yale, and it was published in the New Yorker magazine. This is how I know. The whole world knew. And what I found out was that his verbal score to Yale was 570, considerably lower than mine. He had a C average from high school, and he never got a grade better than a B in his 4 years at Yale. Now, of course, the big difference is he's president, and I'm still just a professor, right? But I can tell you that regardless of how I might have felt as an affirmative action admin, in fact, it never made me feel bad. I was just motivated. I now understand that there are certain kinds of affirmative action practice in this country that has never been named such. That those of privilege in this country have also gotten more than their fair share, but nobody had to remind them. So I want to tell all the students here particularly that if you are here at Bellevue Community College and if somebody says you were given an opportunity even though you didn't quite meet the standards, don't let that be a deterrence, you see. Just let that motivate you, because that's really what affirmative action means. And that's what I want to talk about today. From that moment on, I have discovered the world. Here I am in America, coming from another part of the world, and Stanford opened up not only just generally speaking educational opportunities, it literally opened up the world for me. Because Stanford, as part of my undergraduate education, sent me to Brazil. Now, you might say, well, what does someone looking like her want to do in Brazil? Well, let me tell you, when I went to Brazil, I discovered not only a whole new world I had not been exposed to, but I discovered that Brazil was a very diverse society. Not your usual diversity that everybody knows about, no? Brazilians of African descent because of slavery, Brazilians of indigenous heritage because of the indigenous populations, those we know. But I found Japanese in Brazil and Chinese in Brazil. And I found a whole history that I was not taught in my classes on Brazilian history. And that began to open up something for me. Consequently, in pursuing my education at Stanford, I decided that, like so many in my generation, we had to know more about the rest of the world. And not just about the rest of the world in themselves, but also how the rest of the world looked at us in America. This is in the 60s when we started questioning the war in Southeast Asia, my generation. Many of my classmates refused to go fight the war, and took the consequences. We talked about the civil rights movement, but along with the civil rights movement, there was a women's movement, the gay and lesbian movement, and the other ethnic and racial pride movements. They all converged in the 60s. It had tremendous impact on our curriculum and tremendous impact in how we approached education. And I really felt deeply that our best and brightest of my generation branched out, sought new knowledge and new ways of looking at things. And for us in that generation, studying what we call the third world was about as radical as we could get. So many of us studied Africa, Latin American, Caribbean, Asia, the Middle East. And then from there, we brought the studies back home. And so a good number of my generation also became the very first generation to create this field that we call ethnic studies, race and ethnic studies, no? Asian American studies, Chicano and Chicana studies, the expansion of African American, what then was still called Black studies, and Native American studies. And that's what I've been doing for the last 20 years of my life, but bringing area studies, Latin American studies, and ethnic studies together, to create a different worldview and to investigate our collective experiences from multiple perspectives. So I'm going to share with you a little bit of what I have learned in my own journey of learning. And I start with something that struck me many years ago. About 10 years ago, I was asked, you remember, 10 years ago or so, exactly 10 years ago, 1992, the country geared up to celebrate 500 years of Columbus, the Columbus Quincentenary, 500 years. And the thought then, remember the word celebration, the thought then was, here is something to celebrate, 500 years of Columbus. And of course the premise is that it was a good thing, the Columbus voyages and quote-unquote conquest of America was a good thing. I was already then in Colorado. I discovered something, this is a little trivia. Did you know that Columbus Day was invented by Italians in Colorado? I bet you didn't know that. Anyway, one of the things that Coloradans used to claim, now because of what has happened, they're a little bit more muted on the subject matter. But in 1992, the governor of Colorado appointed me and a lot of people to this Quincentenary Committee. And it was then that many of us began to think seriously about the meaning of Columbus, about this thing called 1492. And I think, much to our surprise, even to me, who studies America, when our Native American brothers and sisters began to speak out and say, what is there to celebrate? 500 years of what? Of conquest, of genocide, of erasure of our history and culture and identity. And I use the word genocide, which is another word we don't usually attach to our American history. So it was the first time, I think, that many of us in America heard the collective voices of our Native brothers and sisters in protest. And then our African American brothers and sisters also raised their voice in protest and say, yeah, really, what's there to celebrate? 400 years of slavery, another 100 years of Jim Crow and apartheid, and a continuing struggle for equality in this country. And then our Chicano and Chicana and Puerto Rican and Latino brothers also said, yeah, right. What is there to celebrate? Right? And so it got the ball rolling. And then University of Wisconsin-Madison, in the name of equal opportunity, invited me to speak about the meaning of Columbus to Asian Americans. And I thought, oh, well, God, they just don't want to leave anybody out. Because even at first I thought, well, what's the connection? Asian Americans and Columbus? Nobody ever made a connection. And then, of course, it dawned on me. So that's what I want to talk about. All of these connections to 1492 and to the making of America. Now, I did, of course, figure out the connection. Think about it. Where was Columbus heading in 1492? He was heading our way, right? But he got lost along the way. He had a bad sense of geography. He didn't know there was something called America lying between Europe and Asia. He landed somewhere. He misnamed the people. He insisted he was in Asia, so he called the people he encountered Indians. He was heading to Las Indies. So imagine that collective sigh of relief in China when Columbus didn't get there, right? Because we know what happened to the native peoples of America. Anyway, that was a connection I made. But it wasn't very long after that, of course, that the Europeans did find that new route. they did find their way to Asia. Along the way, the Spaniards also colonized Las Filipinas, the Philippines, this archipelago lying there in the middle of the Pacific, in order to facilitate trade between Asia, the Americas, and Europe. This is really the beginning of globalization and global history. Well, what I'm really saying is that if you read American history this way, you see immediately that America was a diverse country, multiracial, multicultural, multilingual from the get-go. Right? It's so obvious. A handful of Europeans came, and as they covered all of the Americas, from Canada to Patagonia to Argentina, they found that this entire continent, or two continents, was densely populated with tens and millions of people. And that the original inhabitants, or the first Americans, or whatever term we use, were themselves diverse. Hundreds of languages, cultures, peoples. The Europeans came over, and soon after that brought over, in the course of the next 3 centuries, 25, 30 million Africans all across the Americas to work as cheap labor. Eventually, as the United States of America took shape and defined our borders, we also found ourselves incorporating Spanish-speaking peoples. And then, of course, by the middle of the 19th century, we also brought over Asians. So this country has always been diverse, and with time, increasingly diverse. That's one set of facts. But the other is also intriguing and interesting. That is, out of the movement of the 60s, we invented certain terms like diversity, like pluralism, like multiculturalism. We invented these terms, you would think, simply to name the reality of America and to come to grips with what we have always been. But it isn't quite so simple, you see, because if it is merely naming a phenomenon that is widely acknowledged and there for everyone to see, then why is the term or the idea of diversity so controversial? You see? Why is it? Because out of the 60s, affirmative action, bilingualism, all of these things that we associate with diversity has stirred up America in ways that few other things have. Given rise to what we have called the culture wars, to what one side has derisively called politically correct, and then, of course, very intense organized movements to undo all the good things that we think has come out of the 60s. My question is, why has America found diversity such a difficult issue to deal with? It really is not widely accepted. There's a lot of, continuing to today, a lot of debate and discussion about whether diversity is a good thing, about whether America should be more than monolingual. America is very ambivalent about a lot of these issues. We may be all the choir here, but that doesn't mean the world outside agrees with us. So I thought that was really interesting. Basically, this huge paradox of American history. America, a country that is multiracial, multicultural from its inception, and America that refuses in certain other ways, very deep-seated ways, to acknowledge its diversity. And, we have learned people, prominent people like Arthur Schlesinger, who has criticized those of us who call ourselves multiculturalists and who are in favor of diversity. They say all this talk about diversity is disuniting America. Right? There's a book written by Arthur Schlesinger called The Disuniting of America. No? And others have called the Voices for Diversity tribalism. I think that's a very unfortunate choice of words, but it's a negative connotation. No, tribalism. The same idea, disuniting of America. No? Then when the critics of multiculturalism and diversity weighed in and started critiquing affirmative action, what do they say about affirmative action? They say it is lowering standards, it is compromising excellence, no? It contradicts the American ideal of the meritocracy. In other words, it's un-American. No? And if you try to be sensitive to stereotypes and differences that we find disturbing, if we try to learn to be sensitive about that and to watch our language and our behavior and resist stereotyping, the critics of multiculturalism say what? They say, oh, you're just being politically correct. You see? And so on and so forth. We have Lynn Cheney, the wife of our current vice president, who became a real heavy hitter and very much a critic of diversity and multiculturalism, especially when she headed the National Endowment for the Humanities, the country's premier federal agency for the humanities. So I asked myself, why this paradox? Why a country that is diverse from its inception, yet have so much difficulty accepting diversity and dealing with diversity? And of course, what I'm really talking about then is an ideological struggle. It's a question of power. And on the one side, we have a group called multiculturalists. And we thought, that we were only embracing the obvious. And then we found that there's a very well-organized, huge opposition to multiculturalism and to diversity. And I thought, now what do we call the opposition? I want to characterize this ideological war. I know that on one side, the term multiculturalist is a good term. I thought on the other side to simply call them the anti-multiculturalist lacks imagination. Right? So I said, now I'm going to find a better term. And I found the term in American history. I called the other side the triumphalists. So here's the ideological war. The multiculturalists and the triumphalists. Let me tell you what I found and the answer to my question, this American paradox. Okay? And again, I want to remind you that for my own personal awakening, it was the Columbus Quincentenary that caused me to think about this. Now let me tell you what triumphalists are so you understand the other side. Triumphalist is not a left-right conservative political position exactly. I want to disabuse you of that from the very beginning. Triumphalists represent a vast array of American society. They consist of conservatives, neoconservatives, liberals. They are scholars and historians. They are writers. They are high government officials. They are opinion makers. But what they have in common is that they champion a traditionalist view of American history, one characterized as an unbroken string of successes, and who willingly ignore inconvenient inconsistencies and readily rationalize the failures. They pronounce the triumphant march towards freedom and democracy as true and universal, as good and fair for all times and for all Americans. Furthermore, the triumphalists proclaim, as American triumphs or victories or successes are built on the traditions of Western civilization, American culture is Western culture. Thus, American national identity is European derived. Let me let the triumphalists speak to them for themselves. Give you a few examples. One of them you see on the Sunday morning news, still every week. His name is George Will. No, he's on the ABC Sunday News. And I just took this random quote from him. You can see variations of this in many places. He says, "I wish to affirm this fact. America is predominantly a product of the Western tradition and is predominantly good because that tradition is good." There's another well-known triumphalist, also frequently in the news, but also in the print media. His name is Charles Krauthammer, Krauthammer. And I took this from a commentary he made about an exhibit at the Smithsonian almost 10 years ago. This exhibit was called The Opening of the American West. You know, the American West, where we are now, holds a mythic place in American history. It symbolizes the expansion of American freedom, right? The frontier, the West, the homesteaders, the pioneers, etc. No? Now, a group of young curators in the Smithsonian took these familiar paintings of the triumphant march towards the West. You know, you've seen all these huge paintings, right? But what these curators did, and what made this exhibit then so controversial, was that they captioned these paintings a little bit differently than the way they have traditionally or typically been captioned up to then. What these young curators said, as people went through this exhibit, was to say, look behind the scenes, look between the lines, look under the feet of the horses as you watch these paintings depicting the triumphal march towards the West. And what these curators were asking us to do is to say, at what price did the opening of the American West? No? At what price, at whose cost, and those kind of questions. In other words, they thought, engaged in a good educational project of asking the viewers at this museum to think critically of what they were seeing and to ask them new questions. But they did not anticipate that by doing so, they opened up a can of worms, so to speak. And they got a lot of Americans really upset by simply asking some new questions. And of course, they were motivated to ask the questions because of the Columbus Quincentenary, because of what the Native Americans forced us to think about. No? Anyway, Charles Krauthammer then countered the critics, weighed in with the critics against the curators of this exhibit. And this is what he said. As challenging the curators of this exhibit. He said, the real question is, what really grew on this bloodied soil? He answered his own question. The great modern civilizations of the Americas, a new world of individual rights, an ever-expanding circle of liberty, and twice in this century, a savior of the world from total barbarism. You see the triumphalist tone of his voice, no? Even though he said, yes, the soil was bloodied, but something really fantastic came out of this march towards the West. Let me share with you a third triumphalist, Arthur Schlesinger Jr., a historian of Camelot fame. That means he was with the Kennedys, for those of you too young to know, and others of you who do remember Arthur Schlesinger of Camelot fame. This is the way he very quickly captured American history. He said, the U.S. escaped the divisiveness of a multi-ethnic society by a brilliant solution. Look at his opening sentence. The divisiveness of a multi-ethnic society. By a brilliant solution. the creation of a brand new identity. The point of America was not to preserve old cultures, but to forge a new American culture. By an intermixture with our people, he quoted President George Washington telling his Vice President John Adams, immigrants will become assimilated to our customs, measures, and laws. In a word, soon become one people. What these immigrants have in common, he continues, is, quote, the Western tradition, which is the source of the ideas of individual freedom and political democracy. Very familiar sounding words, because we have all been raised with these sentiments. Finally, a Yale historian, and at that time the undergraduate dean of Yale College, Donald Kagan, in welcoming the incoming freshman class, he said, except for the slaves brought from Africa, he had to make a caveat about that, and I'll tell you why. Except for the slaves brought from Africa, most came voluntarily as families and individuals, usually eager to satisfy desires that could not be met in their former homelands. They swiftly became citizens and within a generation or so, Americans. In our own time, finally, African Americans also have achieved freedom, equality before the law, and full citizenship. What they have in common and what brings them together is a system of laws and beliefs that shaped the establishment of this country, a system developed within the context of Western civilization. Now, for most of us, if not all of us, Americans educated and socialized in this country, we are familiar with this dominant version of American history that these triumphalists have expressed. And they should ring familiar. They should ring familiar to you if you have studied American history. And if you have gone through American education, you have been exposed to this version, what I call the official narrative or the master narrative of American history, which in a nutshell was captured by Donald Kagan. That is, America is built by immigrants who come here voluntarily with their families, who lose their old culture and custom, again, willingly, so that they can help forge this new American identity based on the values of Western civilization, etc., etc. Now, we have a metaphor, of course, for this. It's called the melting pot, right? The melting pot says we all come, we give up our old, we jump into this melting pot, and out comes a new American identity and American culture. And this is what we mean when in our history books we echo our founding fathers. In fact, that very term that we all learned to say, our founding fathers, our national identity, the word seems very inclusive. You know? And so we have all gone along with this idea that yes, this is American history and the official narrative, and all of us are part of this picture and should see ourselves in this picture. But there is something problematic about this version, because this version of national history, this official master narrative, while it may ring true for Americans of European descent, largely rings untrue for other Americans, because the our in our national identity and the we in we the people, while they sound inclusive, have also been historically exclusive. That is the beginning of the answer that I'm finding. That is, the language of inclusiveness in our official founding documents has coexisted alongside a practice of exclusion. Bluntly put, there is another history that other Americans have lived through, that is not incorporated into this universalized official history. For one truth that is omitted in all of these declarations by the triumphalists is that in thinking of those who have built America and benefited from America, the images are overwhelmingly and almost exclusively those of European immigrants and their descendants. To this day, you can test this. When we use the word American, when other words use American, people think of white Americans. That is why we have hyphenated Americans. That is why some of us continue to have to answer the question, where are you really from? Or people say to me, you don't have an accent. Or you have just a slight trace of accent. Or where is your accent from? They just have to find an accent in me, see? Because they want to place me somewhere else. Well, what has happened? Think of it. If American history is officially told as a history of immigrants who come here willingly, voluntarily, who are immediately incorporated into American society and participate in its formation and benefit, then where does it leave certain Americans? Let's start systematically and quickly examine African Americans. Who in their right mind, except the most unreasonable, what reasonable person in their right mind, let me put it this way, would characterize 20 million plus Africans brought over here as slaves as voluntary immigrants? You see? Yes, they had to leave their homeland. Yes, they had to cross an ocean. But you have to be a very unreasonable person to say that they came over here voluntarily with their families. And then what happened to Africans after they came here? When the founding fathers founded this nation and said all men are created equal, never mind the women, all men are created equal, and yet they were slaveholders. Well, it's simple, you see. First of all, slaves were defined first and foremost as property, not as people. And secondly, for taxation purposes, they were defined then as fractions of a human being. However you look at it, slaves were dehumanized. They were not immigrants, so how could they be included in this official history that says this nation was built by voluntary immigrants? So I say that's one very concrete example of exclusion. And then, of course, we know what happened. Yes, we freed the slaves after several centuries of slavery. But after a small window of freedom, what happened to Americans of slave descent? We re-enslaved them through the system of apartheid, right? Through the Jim Crow laws for another 100 years. Well, let's move on. You would have to be the most unreasonable person if you think Native Americans are immigrants. They were here to begin with. You know, they didn't go anywhere. They didn't come from any place. And what did we do with the Native Americans? Well, this is a history of the Native Americans that we have to remind ourselves of, which the triumphalists conveniently fail to remember. How did we take the land, the water, the resources of the native peoples who were here to begin with? We, meaning these law-abiding Europeans, who came armed with all kinds of Western legal traditions. Well, we signed treaties, didn't we? You see? And how many treaties did we sign? Almost 400 treaties, and every one of them are still in the books. Because if we go and take these treaties off the books, we will be a lawless nation. We will be thieves. We would then have to acknowledge that we stole all this. So on the one hand, we can't take these treaties off the books. But on the other hand, we have systematically gone and violated all of these treaties, or as many as we possibly can get away with. Right? And because we have signed treaties, international law says you have to acknowledge then those you sign treaties with as sovereign nations, as sovereign entities. So we have really put ourselves in this huge bind. It wasn't until after World War I, in 1924, that the United States finally extended U.S. citizenship to all Native Americans. Another concrete example of exclusion. Native Americans clearly are not part of the United States until 1924. And by then, of course, most of them had died. And the few that were remaining, what did we do? We forced them onto reservations, onto the most bleak and forlorn parcels of American territory with few economic opportunities. And if we found natural resources under the land that we forced them on, such as the Cherokees, first we forced them to march from the East Coast, from what is now Georgia and places like that, to Oklahoma, because we thought, just a piece of rock, nobody wants Oklahoma. And then what did we discover? Oil. No? And then we told the Cherokees, sorry, we want the oil, would you mind moving again? So my point is, Native Americans have not been included, never been included in our national history and in the way we've thought about America, except as what? As a nuisance, as an obstacle, as something to get out of the way of, to get them out of the way. Unlike Latin America or Mexico or Peru, where they found some uses for these native peoples, they made them work for them with cheap labor. We imported Africans. We didn't even want the native peoples to work for us in this country. We'd rather that they go away. Well, let's move on. Our original Latinos, Hispanics, the Mexican Americans, how did they get to be a part of America? Well, there's something about American history that conveniently forgets or omits certain things. Let me ask you here, there's nothing to be embarrassed about. What's 1848? What happened in 1848? No? Does anybody know? The Mexican-American War, 1846, and what happened in 1848? That's one thing, but Texas, yes, you're getting close. What is the name of the treaty that the United States signed with Mexico in 1848 after we beat up on Mexico and forced them to sign this treaty? Resulted in Mexico giving up almost half of its national territory to the United States, that consisted of California, Nuevo Mexico, Arizona, Colorado, and then, of course, for good measure, we threw in Texas as well, eventually. What is that treaty called? How come you don't know about it? How come you know about the Magna Carta and 1066 and all these wonderful things and you don't know about 1848? What is it? Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. And if you know your U.S. history and you could not answer because you did not answer that question, don't blame me. Ask your professors here, why do we not know about 1848? Is it one of those convenient facts that has been denied to us in our official American history? Yes, it is, because it's inconvenient. What happened in 1898, exactly 50 years later? What other brown-skinned, Spanish-speaking Catholic people did we incorporate? Who? What group? Filipinos, very good. And what other group closer to home? The Puerto Ricanos. You know, you can't tell a Puerto Rican if you get into a fight with them to go back where they come from. You don't tell a Mexican person to go back where they come from if you get into a fight with them here in this state or in Colorado, because they will say, my family's been here for 5 generations. How long have you been here? In other words, the original brown-skinned, Catholic, mestizo, mulatto, Latino didn't come over as immigrants either. We territorially incorporated them. How could we describe the original Mexican, American, or Puerto Rican as an immigrant when they didn't even step out of the front door of their own home, but we drew the international boundary around them? Another example of exclusion, wasn't it? But when we incorporated the mestizos from Mexico in the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, if you go back to read that treaty, we said we would honor their culture, their language, their heritage, their religion, but we have not done so because all through the Southwest, in the last 10 years or so, we have had this English-only movement, which is nothing but depriving the Spanish speakers of their original heritage. And another violation, frankly, of a treaty that we signed. Okay, so let's move on. I have found one group that looks like immigrants, but not from Europe. You know how we think of immigrants in our imagination? They have to cross an ocean. You can't fly in, no? You got to cross an ocean. So I found a group that crossed an ocean that's even bigger and vaster than the Atlantic. This is the Pacific Ocean. And they came over not as slaves, even though sometimes under duress and difficult conditions. So these are the original Asians, the Chinese, the Japanese. No? Later on, some Koreans, some Punjabis, some Filipinos, they came over as immigrants crossing a vast ocean. And I thought, wonderful. Now we have another example of an immigrant group, just like those Europeans. Until much later in my own education, I found out some other inconvenient facts that were omitted from my education, as a PhD in history, no less. No? Because these inconvenient facts, I say they're inconvenient facts because they don't fit into that master narrative. This is the inconvenient fact. And I'm not going to embarrass you, but I ask you another question. 1790, shortly after the country was founded, our founding fathers already knew this country was going to expand and that it will be populated in large part by newcomers, by immigrants. And so the founding fathers wrote this law in 1790 called the U.S. Naturalization Law. Naturalization is a process by which immigrants become citizens. 1790, very early after the founding of the nation, and the law says what? Only free white immigrants can become citizens. There it is, the racial criterion for citizenship. But you know what? Many of you probably say, I didn't know that. Did you know that? No. Did you know that? No. Why is that? Why is that not front and center in our history books? Because it's an inconvenient fact, and because the way the country imagined immigrants were immigrants from Europe, after all, right? And it's even more refined. At the time this law was written, the idea of those immigrants were really Irish, not even Irish, Scotsmen, Brits, Germans, no? A limited group of Europeans even. Didn't include Jews, didn't include Catholics, didn't include the southern dark-skinned Italians, didn't include the Irish. Nevertheless, those Europeans started coming over, and in time the law all came to cover them. But there was one group who came over from Asia, from across the Pacific, and asked for citizenship, and they were denied. The Chinese were denied, the Japanese were denied, the Punjabi, the Indians from India were denied, the East Indians. Why were they denied? By courts in California and all the way up to the Supreme Court, because of this naturalization law that says only white immigrants can become citizens. So the courts were asked to rule all the way into the early 20th century, all the way until the 1920s. Can these people become citizens if they come from Asia? And case after case, the court said no, because they are not white. My point is, it's another form of exclusion. Another form of exclusion. That while Asians were brought to America as cheap labor, after the end of slavery and the West was opened up and we needed labor-intensive enterprises to build up the economy, right? Building the railroads, opening the mines, opening up the land for agriculture. These are all labor-intensive. The native Californians had died out. We couldn't export slavery to the West since it was on its way out too as an institution, as a form of labor. So Asians were brought over also to Hawaii to work in the plantations, no? As contract laborers, as indentured servants, if you will. But when they decided to stay, they went for citizenship, they were told, sorry, citizenship denied because you're not white. Over and over and over again. And then in states like California and Colorado and Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, all the western states, the local legislators wrote the law regarding land ownership tied to the right to citizenship. And the Alien Land Law of California, which was the prototype of all of these laws, said immigrants ineligible for citizenship, which is the official category then given to Asian immigrants. These were immigrants to be sure, but they were immigrants ineligible for citizenship, cannot buy land. They can work the land, they can lease the land, they can borrow the land, they can do whatever, but they can never own land. You see? Another form of exclusion. And so I think I have found the answer then to my question, this paradox. This paradox of why a country that was diverse and multicultural, multiracial, multilingual from the get-go, from the inception, is also a country that cannot imagine itself as being diverse. That when confronted with the idea of diversity, to this day has trouble dealing with it. And I want to then conclude this very brief view of American history from other perspectives with a quote from one of my favorite historians, whose book I highly recommend to you. His name is Alexander Saxton, S-A-X-T-O-N, retired from UCLA, who is a white male but not quite dead. No? He's one of my heroes. So when I use the word white male, it's a symbolic thing. It's somebody who clings to a certain worldview. You can be a white male and be a multiculturalist, as Alexander Saxton is. You see? So Professor Saxton also named this contradiction. And this is what he says. He says, these fundamental contradictions then, no? Between America, let me just explain this contradiction, and then I will quote Professor Saxton to conclude my talk. The fundamental contradiction, and this to me explains why we have trouble dealing with diversity. The fundamental contradiction, a contradiction is a conflict that has no resolution, no? Unless something gives, right? Something has to give. Fundamental contradiction between America's multiracial origins and growing multiracial reality on the one hand, and its still dominant self-image as white and European on the other, between stated ideals of freedom and democracy for all, no? Alongside a racialist social order that has historically relegated peoples of color, that is those that history has constructed as not white, to an inferior status as cheap labor at best, and extraneous population at worst, but in any case not equal citizens. This is a contradiction that multiculturalism and multicultural scholars and students have identified and are grappling with and seek to find a resolution for. Something has to give. And so Alexander Saxton captures it very well in, I believe, his last book called The Rise and Fall of the White Republic. You see, he names things differently in the way he now writes American history. No? The White Republic. He said, America's, I can't find my, just a minute. what he says is that America's, I can't find my page with the quote, so you're going to have to trust me. Sorry about this. What he names is that America's supposed openness to newcomers has been limited to European diversity. All kinds of Europeans came over, representing all sorts of ethnicities from Europe, forcing America to redefine America and redefine whiteness to ultimately include all the diversity represented by Europe. As I noted earlier, the Italians at first had trouble being accepted, but eventually they were accepted. The Irish had trouble being accepted, but they too eventually became accepted. The Jews from Eastern Europe found it difficult originally, but they too became white. And what is the defining difference then, according to Saxton and those of us in ethnic studies, is this strict racial divide that has not budged in America. No? That there are certain groups in America that have not been just ethnically constructed as different, but racially constructed. And that this is what we refuse to deal with in America. No? The idea of racial subordination. And putting it another way, the term that Alexander Saxton uses that is so stark and shocking, but that some of us are beginning to use because it's necessary to put that back into the vocabulary, that's suggested in the title of his book, The White Republic, and that is the inherent contradiction, is that multicultural America has coexisted alongside white supremacy in America. Now think about that. Multicultural America coexisting along white supremacy America. And this is the irreconcilable contradiction that we're dealing with. No? We're not going to do anything with this multiculturalism because that's a reality. So in order to resolve this contradiction, what has to give? White supremacy. White supremacy has to give. I think that is my approach to diversity. No? My understanding of diversity. And what I call redefining America. The challenge to all of us is to redefine America away from white supremacy. And we're still dealing with it. Because a lot of us now are beginning to recognize not only white supremacy, but something called white privilege. That to be white is not just to be different in a different way. No? To be white, this is my story about George Bush as I open. No? His life and my life have been very different because he inherited a set of privileges that he himself didn't even know because it was the norm. And yet everything that was given my way, I not only knew, but I was told about it by those who were giving it to me, right? That's the difference. I know and I acknowledge and I'm grateful for every privilege that has been given to me. That's white privilege, white supremacy. That's a contradiction of America. That's what the Diversity Project is about. That's what multiculturalism is. It is to rethink America, to redefine America, away from our historical contradiction, away from this unspoken norm of white supremacy. Thank you very much. Now I will take, thank you. You know, this is why I think, if it's not obvious already, why diversity is such a contentious issue, because we are asking for power. Not more power, but access to power. No, it is a question of power. That's why I say it's an ideological struggle. Finally, to conclude this, I just cut this out from the Washington Post, an article published in the Washington Post National Weekly magazine, which is a compilation of the most interesting articles and editorials and commentaries of that week. This is from the week of May 20th to 26th. And You might have seen the story in your local papers too, because it's just a news story. And the story is that President Bush now wants to reintroduce something called civics in K through 12, in high school. How many of you remember civics? See, it takes a certain generation, right? Because you don't have civics anymore. Those of us who went through high school in the 60s, we had civics. What is civics? Citizenship classes. Teach us to be good citizens, right? He wants to reintroduce civics. And I say, great, let's reintroduce civics, but let's not do it the 50s and 60s way. If we're going to reintroduce civics and citizenship, no? Let's start by telling all Americans how citizenship has been constructed in this country and how citizenship has been a means of exclusion for much of our history. Start with the historical fact, because until we deal with that, I don't think we could march forward as a united people. See? If we don't deal with our past, how do we know what future we're going to march towards? So I urge all of you here, particularly those of you who plan to be teachers, you will probably be dealing with this civics idea, no? And if you find yourself teaching civics or asked to teach civics in the classroom, think about civics for the 21st century and civics in the age of diversity, and not teach the civics class that I had, where I had to go around talking about our founding fathers. Now, it's really peculiar to be a woman, no? To be a person of color, and to be part of a community who was denied citizenship. By the way, that 1790s law, do you know when it was abolished? 1952. No? It lasted a long, long time. No? Asian immigrants were not allowed to become citizens. Now, what happened to Japanese Americans is that those who were born in America invoked the 14th Amendment and became citizens by birth. Not because. And there were attempts to deny the children of Asian immigrants otherwise ineligible for citizenship. And that was taken to the Supreme Court, because the Supreme Court had to grapple with these two laws that contradicted each other. One that says Asian immigrants cannot be citizens, and there were attempts in California and all through the country to deny the children of these immigrants born in America of citizenship because of their parents' status. But they took it to the courts and say, wait a minute, there's a 14th Amendment. Now, what was the 14th Amendment? It was enacted after the Civil War to give citizenship to the freed slaves. Because after we freed the slaves, we had to give them some status. You can't have these people floating around. And because by that time, most slaves were born in America, they were given citizenship by virtue of birth. And this is one of these peculiar things of American history with a very interesting outcome, because the Supreme Court says, yes, by weighing these two laws that contradicted each other, the courts came down in favor of the 14th Amendment and say, yes, even Asians whose parents otherwise cannot be citizens, but who were themselves born in America, they could be citizens. So when we interned the Japanese during World War II, 2/3 of them were U.S. citizens. We did not intern aliens during World War II. We interned U.S. citizens for the most part, you see. One of these quirks of history. Anyway, questions, comments? Please. Mm-hmm.
I'm as old as you are, I think, which means that I can remember life before Reagan.
Mm-hmm. That seemed like yesterday. Yes.
But this has become a greater concern of mine over the past several years, maybe the past 7 or 8 years. One thing that really concerned me when Reagan was elected was that he had this affinity for Latin American economics,
Mm-hmm.
which is the economics that we've got now,
Mm-hmm.
that everyone is used to.
Right.
And it's this huge disparity between the rich, very rich, and the very poor.
Yeah.
We no longer have any sort of sense of civic responsibility. Taxes are a no-no. We have to depend on philanthropy
Mm-hmm.
to get anything done, it
Mm-hmm.
seems.
Okay.
This is the framework in which people of all
Mm-hmm.
are growing up.
A kind of selfishness, right? And self-centeredness, and I'm going it alone. And the question, if yeah.
I mean, before Reagan,
Mm-hmm.
in 1980, we didn't even count homeless
Mm-hmm.
because there weren't homeless.
Mm-hmm.
And now the people that I'm teaching
Mm-hmm.
in college, they accept that homelessness is a category that you should count.
That's
It's a
right.
way of life. It's a lifestyle. And this is horrendous. And it's affecting everyone.
Well, that's right.
Mm-hmm.
Well, maybe in some broader sense of the question of social justice and our collective responsibility for ourselves, the question is, we seem to be getting more self-centered, less involved with others, with society and social issues and problems. The question of whether there was homelessness before Reagan. I'm sure there was homelessness before Reagan. I mean, we had the Depression. We've always had rich and poor. This is not a society with a strong tradition of social welfareism, unlike the Scandinavian countries. But one thing we do know for sure is that the gap between rich and poor in this country has been widening since Reagan, not narrowing. No? In many ways, we are becoming more like a third world country in which we have some obscenely rich people and growing numbers of poor people, truly poor people. But the other question you posed about the way we approach Latin American economies, is that right? And we are telling Latin American economies that they have to go it alone, did you say? The whole free trade principle of Reagan that is very much carried on by Bush Sr., Bush Jr., and let's face it, Clinton as well. There's not a whole lot of difference between Clinton and the Bushes. It's a matter of style. It's not a matter of substance. Truly. So you've all know, I mean, if you read the papers, you know what's happened to Argentina. What has happened to Argentina is that it was the most dutiful follower of the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank, which told Argentina, no, sell all your resources, privatize everything, stop social spending, and you will prosper. And the opposite happened to Argentina. It collapsed. The economy has totally collapsed. Now, here's the thing that I found out, and many of us who look at the world scene found out. One thing is for the United States to preach free trade to other countries, meaning what? Don't erect barriers, let American goods flow in unfettered so that we can dump on your market and sell you everything free. But guess what we do while we preach free trade to Mexico and Argentina? Well, you know what we did. We just set up steel imports, didn't we? President just signed $186 billion of farm aid. What do you think that means? Huh? Farm aid. It is a blow against free trade. No? It is to subsidize the big farmers of this country, not just farmers. That's really a misnomer. The big agricultural companies like IBP and Land of Lakes and all these names, Montfort in Colorado, all these big corporate giants, to subsidize them. The big farmers will benefit, not the small family farms. But basically, we don't practice what we preach. No? We slap all kinds of barriers on American goods, American products, and then we don't open our markets to cheaper goods from Argentina, for example, from Mexico, from the Philippines, for example. So it's like two sets of standards. The free trade thing is what is causing a lot of problems for Latin America. Any other questions or comments? Yes?
I was just thinking about what steps can I take as a student to help disband this white supremacy and move towards multiculturalism?
Right. Good question. This young man who says, what steps can he take? Well, follow the example of Professor Saxton, right? He's a white male, still alive, kicking, just like you. In other words, white supremacy is not a descriptor. It's a worldview. It's an ideology. It's an orientation, right? And so as a white male, And there is a movement actually around the country of white males who have inherited privileges, who make themselves very conscious of these unearned privileges. And when they see it coming their way, they say what? I haven't earned it. No, I refuse it. But there's also the other side. The other side is to say, wait a minute, do we still need something like affirmative action? Right? Which side am I going to be on in this issue? See? Now, it's very seductive because Asian Americans fall into this category and white women fall into this category as well. The opponents of affirmative action are now seducing white women, Asian Americans, and of course the white males to say what? This is reverse discrimination. If we continue to support affirmative action, it means you're going to get less or you won't get what you deserve. See? It's very easy for us to fall into that kind of thinking. But you know what, when you think about it, affirmative action, yes, it has certainly opened doors, but it is so minute in the spaces it has created that it really doesn't eat too much into those who are already quite privileged. It doesn't. No, the statistics show that. So one of the things you can do is to not fall into these seductive overtures, no? And to fight on the side of social justice, I think. And to fight for a curriculum and a history that speaks the truth from multiple perspectives. No? For you to challenge a history text or history class, and I mean history broadly, that says all of us in America enjoy equal rights. This universal history of freedom for all. And you have to stand up and say, wait a minute. No? I have learned in such a class that that's not true from the African American perspective. Or make sure that your peers and your colleagues know about the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, know about the Naturalization Law of 1790, right? Because I think all we need is to make ourselves aware of a few of these critical facts that have been denied us, and once that happens, you can't think of American history the same way. Can you? You can't think that this is a history that is universal and that speaks truth to all of us.
Okay, so
does that make sense to you?
That makes perfect sense.
Yeah.
But is just awareness enough?
Well, that's the beginning. We always say education is the beginning of undoing ignorance, no? And it's ignorance that blinds us. So it's not the concept is not difficult, is it? But to be educated, you have to be willing to be educated. First, you have to open your mind. You have to be willing to receive these new, not just knowledge or facts, but new perspectives. Or at least to acknowledge there is more than one perspective. That's all I ask. I say for Europeans, this master narrative of the melting pot probably works pretty good, right? It does. The problem is, if you look at the history textbooks, they haven't changed the master narrative too much. What they do is what I call the sidebar approach to American history. Have you seen those textbooks where they have a little shaded sidebar, right? But they don't change the master narrative. That's not enough. If you have enough sidebars clutting all the margins of a page, you got to start asking, hey, when are we going to start integrating the sidebar material into the central narrative of text? You see, you shouldn't teach any subject anymore by clinging to the traditionalist, triumphalist view and say, just like Donald Kagan, except for the slaves from Africa, except for the Mexicans from Mexico, except for the Puerto Ricans, except for the Asians, except for the Native Americans. You know what? When we add up all the excepts, it's already 50%. It's going to be 75% pretty soon. No? The demographics are such. So how many exceptions are you going to make before you start saying, let's rewrite the whole damn thing, you know? That's my project, you see? Yeah.
I just wanted to say, I know you had a purpose on teaching
Oh.
what,
Pardon me?
on a lot of these And that really touched me and helped me to see things from a different point of view. I didn't know about Fidel. I didn't know about that. I didn't know about naturalization. There's just a lot of things I didn't know about until you came. I wanted to tell you.
Thank you. Think if you have a whole semester of history class from an ethnic studies perspective, right? No, I mean, there's just a few things. There are many more, but I hope that caused you to think critically and say, what else don't I know? What else have I been denied? And see, if I've been denied enough things, can I still buy into that master narrative? No? Right? Let me just say, listen to Bill Bennett. He is an unreconstructed triumphalist. You should see him today. You know who Bill Bennett is? Former Education Secretary, former Director of the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is now America's moral czar, self-appointed. You know, he writes all these books about virtue this and virtue that and morals this and moral that. And I hear him on the morning shows, and I'm appalled. I'm shocked. But he gets a big forum. He's very legitimate. See? And I've debated a lot of these people, and if I point out these things, they would just dismiss me and say, well, except for. They are very intransigent. So it's not an easy road to hoe. You know, it's going to be a real uphill struggle. It's going to be an uphill struggle because school boards across America who determine the books used for children are not buying into this view. The Texas school board certainly is not buying this view. There's a school board in Florida that recently voted, the school board voted that the teachers must teach that Western civilization is superior to everything else. Well, we're not even talking about equality. He said they must teach that it's superior. No? So it's a big struggle, and it will continue to be until all of you get into the classrooms and onto the school boards. That's what I mean. You have to. It isn't enough just to say, yeah, you know, I've got my eyes open, I've got my mind open. No. You've got to do something about it. You have to not only become the teachers, the scholars, but you have to be involved politically where decisions are made. Yeah. Who else did you say? Juan? Juan? Yes?
I just want to comment that Bellevue Community College has a wonderful news program, international news, both morning and 6 o'clock.
Yeah.
It's the only news I listen to because it's very different and has a different viewpoint.
That's right. Really good. Anyone else? Yes.
You spoke about power, and this is an issue of power, and just in this last comment, you also mentioned the word virtue.
Yeah.
And so I wanted to ask you about the issue of beyond power, morality, and how that's a complicating factor, because I think another overtone to all of this is this sense, like manifest destiny, the high of religious morality and rightness that's overlaid upon the racial issue. And I wondered if you could comment on that.
Well, you know, religion is an interesting thing because I think most of us would like to think religion is a personal and private matter. But religion also has been caught up in politics. That's been the case throughout history. And lots of things have been done in the name of all kinds of religions. No? You know, sometimes in my religion, and I say, I don't subscribe to that, but my religion was invoked. So religion cannot, unfortunately, be separated from politics either. So, you know, I don't know if you agree with that. I think we like to think that religion is a private matter, it's a personal matter, it's my moral makeup, right? But it isn't that way at all in history, is it? It is invoked by those who want power to justify certain actions. I mean, it's always very difficult for me to differentiate when we look at the question in Ireland. If we look at currently what's happening in the Middle East, is it religion? Is it religion that is a conflict, or is it something else disguised as religion?
Well, I wonder if that's part of the master narrative.
Well, our master narrative in America says what? This is separation of church and state. But that is not true. This is a highly Christian country, and if you're not Christian, it is very difficult to fit in. That's the other, there are all kinds of side master narratives, you know, if you want to add to it, right? Isn't that what we're told? There's no official religion, separation of church and state.
But we're one nation under God.
Well, who's God? Who's God?
Exactly.
Who's God? Yeah. I think this is in my reading anyway, a very Christian country, and if you're not Christian, it's hard to fit in. I mean, it's brought home today. You know, if you're Islam, you don't fit in. There's no place for you in this country. So that's going to be another challenge we're going to have to deal with. How religion fits into all of this. Yeah. Yes? Any other question? Ron thinks I should step away. So he's tired. He wants to take me home. Thank you.